Ladies and gents, my name is Matt Locke and you're listening to, and perhaps watching, the Unleashing Potential podcast. It's in these episodes that I chat with a range of progressive individuals who are unleashing their potential on the world around them at work and in life. With that said, I'm glad you're here so you can join me as we take a deep dive with today's guest. Hi Luke, great to have you on the podcast. It's good morning from this end, but I know it's good afternoon where you are. So good to have you here, and maybe you could just share a little bit about yourself, where you are in the world and what it is that you're about.
Well, thank you for having me, Matt. I'm in Toronto, Canada. It is nearing evening here, actually. We're just winding up a day, and I appreciate the invitation.
Now, very good. Now, I know people will have already heard that you're into hypnosis. You're actually all about making hypnosis make sense, which I love. And whilst we're not going to spend too long actually talking about how hypnotherapy works, it would be good just to have a feel for anyone who's not familiar with it, or maybe have only seen the stagecraft on television. What's hypnosis really about? And in what applications do you tend to use it?
Well, I'll summarize my answer to the best of my ability, because this is a topic where if you got me started, I could talk for the next 5 hours. So I'll summarize it like this. People have the ability to open their minds on purpose. So when you're listening to a storyteller, for example, or if you're listening to a lecturer you really respect, you might put aside your usual critical analytical thinking to listen wholeheartedly to what the speaker is saying. On top of that, a speaker is able to speak in ways that kind of resonate more deeply with a person's emotions, or they're able to speak in a way that's more influential, that's more persuasive. So when you kind of put these two things together, hypnosis is fundamentally the hypnotist's use of words or verbal suggestions to affect the client in the ways that the client has agreed to. The hypnosis part is what we call an inwardly focused, deeply relaxed state of mind. There is no magic to it. There is no mysticism to it. It's fundamentally a state where the clients turn inwardly, they're relaxed. It's kind of like meditation, except with the guidance and the influence of the hypnotist at the same time. And typically, anything in the realm of what benefits from a change in attitude or a change in perspective, such as um, any kind of fear or anxiety, many bad habits like smoking or overeating, um, is something that in most cases hypnotherapy can help with. It depends a lot on how suggestible the person is. Where the more suggestible the person is, the easier it is. They'll be able to turn inwardly and accept new ideas. But fundamentally, it is that. And anything outside the realm of what can be affected by adoption of a new attitude or perspective probably can't be helped through hypnosis.
Yeah, sure. No, thank you. It would probably be fascinating to talk about it for 5 hours with you, but no, I appreciate that. And certainly hypnotherapy is something that I've had experience with, albeit a long time ago. Back in the day, my father was a dental surgeon for about 3 million years. And back then when he qualified, hypnotherapy was actually part of his dental training. And sadly, it's not now. And I say it that way because I've seen over the years how he's used that hypnotherapy to great effect with a handful of patients and some personal friends and family. He never charged for the service. It was something he would roll out at the right time with the right person for the right reason. So it was never financially incentivized, let's say. And I've seen and felt the benefit of it. And I know that he felt quite frustrated when you'd see the on-stage hypnotists, using it for entertainment and getting people to do all sorts of crazy things for the purposes of entertainment. And he felt that really did undermine the power of hypnotherapy, and so many people who could be benefited by it, but now have this perception of what it is, and it's not for me. Yes. And I don't want to be made to do crazy things that I don't want to. Yeah. You're nodding your head. I mean, I'm guessing you're agreeing with his approach or his thoughts around that.
Absolutely. It does seem to be that in the 1950s, in the 1960s, I can actually name one of the major trainers of dentists and doctors at the time, Dave Ellman. He popularized the medical and dental use of hypnotherapy, and he went around the world training, usually in the English-speaking world, training dentists and doctors in how to use hypnosis, which I often describe as advanced bedside manner when I'm talking to medical professionals, because essentially, you're using words to reassure the client that everything's going to be fine and they're going to feel all right. And um, I'm going to summarize stage hypnosis as getting people to accept bizarre ideas temporarily. And I'm going to summarize my work as getting people to accept completely normal and very helpful ideas for the rest of their lives, which overlaps much more with what your dad used to do. And that makes the work that a hypnotherapist does quite different from what a stage hypnotist does because they're different challenges. On stage, showmanship matters a lot. On stage, you have to be selective about the people you keep on stage. In my office, I have to, or at least I want to work with as many people as possible. Um, in in here, people are looking not just to kind of take on an idea while they're in the chair. They want to also have the idea in a week, in a month, in a year. But no one leaves a stage show feeling like they're a dog a month or a year later.
Absolutely not. Um, again, I will. It's interesting you talk about, what you're doing is getting people to accept perfectly normal ideas for the rest of their lives. And my personal example, and we didn't talk about this previously, was literally 25 years ago ish. I developed a fear of travel, of flying in particular, and I couldn't explain it. There was no reason that I was aware I couldn't explain it, and therefore made it even more frustrating. And it took basically 2 10-minute sessions with my dad. And I went into the first session as a bit of a non-believer, a bit of a skeptic. And I've never felt such a sense of relaxation as I did in those 2 sessions. 10, well, maybe there were 20 minutes, and I lost track of time perhaps, but they weren't long, is my point. And there's only 2 of them. And he gave me a little technique to use, which I can use to this day if I'm feeling anxious, and it works. But interestingly, even now, let's say, overcame that fear of air travel 25 years ago with his help. And since then, I've done a lot of air travel, certainly the 2 decades of sort of senior corporate roles, traveling really globally for 6 months of each year. And wouldn't even think, like for me, getting on a plane is like getting in a taxi. I wouldn't even think about it. Yet, on every single flight, once I'm strapped into my seat and we push back from the hub, from the terminal, the next thing I know is I wake up as the ding, the seatbelt sign light goes out. So we've reached our cruising altitude, and that's when I kind of wake up and feel great, because that's what he put in there all those years ago. But it's interesting how it's so powerful that I'm not even thinking about it. I'm not conscious of that. It just happens, and it's wonderful.
Your dad sounds like a really, really good hypnotist. For him to have done a couple of sessions 25 years ago to still have that effect on you, that's what I'm talking about when I talk about accepting ideas. Like the normal idea that you accepted is that you are safe. You're so safe, you can zone out and breathe normally and feel comfortable. And you accepted that belief, that idea 100%, it sounds like. And 25 years and counting, you've kept that belief inside your head. So that's exactly what I'm talking about when I say accepting completely normal ideas
Yeah,
for the rest of your life.
absolutely. Now, I know that one of the, other than a shared passion for matters of the mind, we also have a similar audience in terms of people in leadership roles or business owners, and basically those who are looking to perhaps unlock more of their own potential. And I loved it. So, what you're doing is not only helping people overcome problems, let's say like claustrophobia or whatever it may be. You mentioned sort of the question that it acts as the umbrella for what it is. We'll talk about today, certainly is, but and that is what do leaders need to hear because it'll help them, and they don't necessarily hear it from anyone else. And
Right.
I think that's really pertinent. And I know that when we had our pre-chat a few weeks ago, um, you talked about how you frame work, and you framed it as work is a game that's played for money. And that really resonated with me. And I think it will with our audience. And I'd love if you could just dig into that. What do you mean by that? And how's that helpful to think of it that way?
Yes. Well, you have to keep in mind, I am speaking to leaders. I am speaking to people who go the extra mile, who do extra work, who are more ambitious than normal, where they don't have to have sacrificed as much earlier in their careers. They don't have to have put in all the extra hours. They don't have to have pursued extra training earlier in their career, but they did. So we're not talking to just literally everybody.
Mm,
We're talking about people who climb the corporate ladder and actually make it all the way up to the top or near the top. So, the set of messages I have to give to someone like that is going to be different from the set of messages I'll give to, say, someone whose career is capped at mid management. So, one of those ideas that you alluded to is that work at this point in your career is kind of a game you play for money, where many senior leaders actually have the financial capacity to retire, but they keep working because they get pleasure out of it, because they want to make a difference, because they believe they can do a particular role better than other people in the world. So there are incentives other than money that drive many leaders to exceed and to excel. Um, where I think a lot of people get overly stressed is if they feel like they must make the next million, if they feel like their buddy who's making uh, half a million a year while they're only making 400,000 a year is doing much better than them, then they are causing unnecessary stress within themselves. And the people who come to me, often they present with a smoking habit or an overeating habit, or they'll drink a bottle of wine every night to cope with workplace stress. And they don't start by telling me that they're overworked or that their identity is too tied up with their work. They'll tell me that they drink too much. They'll tell me that they smoke cigarettes and they want to stop. So, what I'm speaking about is something that even a lot of people don't recognize in themselves. That that at the same time they do exceptionally well in the corporate world, they are neglecting all the rest of their own humanity. And one thing I have to tell them is that once upon a time, you weren't in a senior role. Once upon a time, you didn't even have a job. Once upon a time, you couldn't even walk on your own 2 feet. And back then, you did, however, love play, and you loved family, and you loved music, and you loved nature, and maybe you loved animals back then. And one day you're also going to be retired. So, where all of this is leading to in most people's lives is a second childhood where you can play and be with family and make music or listen to music, and do all of that. Um, but so the message then is that even during your working years, even during the most productive years of your life, your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, um, to have a sense of play is beneficial and appropriate. It also allows one, um, being less stressed, to kind of think on a more visionary level. If you just care about like the details and the small picture and the small stuff, you can't lead as effectively. A leader must look at the biggest picture and the longest timeline. A leader also must have the emotional comfort to sometimes be bold, to sometimes take risk, or to speak up, or to say what's unpopular. If you are to do all of this, you have to take care of yourself. And um, one other thing I have to say to all my leader clients is that you aren't just a mind, you also have a heart with feelings and values and hopes and goals and dreams and a vision for how the world ought to be. And you also have a physical body with trillions of cells, and each one's alive. And your physical body, so just to kind of tie it in with some of the presenting complaints, your body's just as poisoned by excessive alcohol or tobacco as anyone else's. And you can't treat yourself like a machine. You can't treat yourself like an object. I know often in the modern schooling system and the modern corporate world, people are encouraged to kind of see themselves as cogs in a machine, unfortunately. And that's why I have to give people the message that you're not a machine. That's not your place. It's not to be among objects or things that only have value insofar as they can function. You're actually among living beings. You're among the animals of the forest and your pet cat and dog and your friends and the neighborhood children and all living beings that have intrinsic worth, that deserve happiness and peace, and that are not machines, but that have the right to rest, that have the right to play, that have the right to pursue leisure. So if you see, so by the time someone's reached the very top, they kind of have the luxury of seeing work as a game that you play for money. To be honest, if the money weren't there, I think a lot of people wouldn't be doing the work they do, even at the highest levels. Um, but to kind of forget that it's a game, or to lose the element of play, or to forget that you wouldn't do it if it weren't for the money, would cause unnecessary stress and unnecessary suffering. I think if one is to kind of be grounded and realistic about the work, they should remember it's kind of a game that you play for money. But again, I say to my leaders, I don't say to everyone.
Yeah, no, thank you. I have to say, all of that made a lot of sense, and certainly I love that the presenting, the reasons for them presenting, for example, they're almost like first order symptoms, aren't they? But it's actually the second order consequences which are where you're heading and are of sort of much more deeper and more impactful nature. I wonder why it is that, I mean, it's not necessarily the case in every example, but one must assume that for those who have really reached senior leadership positions, top or near the top of large organizations, there's a certain level of intelligence involved, I would assume. And therefore, I wonder why it is that point is missed by so many, when they are, as you say, either drinking or smoking or eating too much, any of those things, any of those first order symptoms, why they're not able to make that assessment themselves or handle that themselves, maybe even have the self-awareness around that. Maybe that is missing, but I wonder why, for people who are so in touch with themselves in so many ways, and certainly in a leadership role and are successful in business. Love to hear your thoughts around that.
Most of these habits started far earlier in life than when they took a leadership position.
Sure.
So a smoking habit, a drinking habit often starts in the teens or maybe the early 20s at the latest. So it definitely goes way back, since before they had so much responsibility or understanding of how to cope with the world or understanding of how to cope with relationships and their own emotions. Um, so that's one answer. One other answer is that when I work with clients, I often hear that they had never thought about it, so the situation, in that way before, so in the way that I describe. Um, People kind of know to seek media coaching if they're going to be interviewed on national television. People kind of know that they'll hire a golf pro if they want to improve their golf swing. But often people try to quit smoking or lose weight on their own. Um, as a hypnotherapist, I kind of occupy a very unique niche in the overall wellness, mental health coaching sphere, in that the work I do is to give people very clear and very directive guidance about what to think. And part of the reason that typically people can hear me talk for a couple of hours and then be done with tobacco is because they're intelligent enough and they're capable enough and their lives are together enough that with a couple of hours of guidance, they get it. And they don't have to hear any kind of reinforcement or repetition after that. It just is until they sit themselves down into a chair like mine to hear or listen very carefully for an hour or two. They just don't have any direction as to how a non-smoker deals with stress or how someone spends an evening without opening a beer or without opening a bottle of
Mm.
wine. Once they get that direction, it's my high achieving clients that pick up on it very quickly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Absolutely. Now I'm conscious, and maybe it's maybe my fault, that we've focused a bit, I guess, on the addiction side, or they're drinking too much,
Yeah.
they're eating, and so on. And
Yeah.
that's not it alone, is it? I mean, people come to you because they're looking to improve their performance. They're looking
Here,
to unlock their potential.
yes. Well, here's a corollary to the idea that work is a game you play for money. Um, One belief I seem to have to communicate over and over again to just multiple people. Being located in downtown Toronto, I'm surrounded by universities and financial buildings and the government buildings on um, on that side. So my typical client, I would say, is high achieving, more educated than average, more affluent than average. Um, so what I find myself having to say to almost all of them is that because you are a human being and because you're among all life on planet Earth, rather than machines or robots and objects, you have fundamental worth. You have um, a dignity that's intrinsic and inviolable. And that means your worth or dignity doesn't depend on your occupation. It doesn't depend on your income. It doesn't depend on whether you're in the good graces of the board. It doesn't depend on the stock price. It doesn't depend on any extrinsic factor. If you can recognize that, your neighbor whose first name you know and you know nothing about, if you can recognize they have worth, they have dignity, you treat them as a human being, then for you to treat yourself like a thing that only has worth insofar as it can perform functions is completely unfair to you. It is a double standard. It is an unnecessary double standard.
Yes.
So I think that people often rise to the top because unfortunately, this objectifying mentality that a person has worth only insofar as they can produce or function, that kind of is encouraged and that's kind of rewarded, right? So, there are performance incentives and KPIs
Yeah,
and
of course.
all sorts of metrics
Share
in the
prices.
modern world, share prices. So, that's where this idea that work is a game you play for money is especially important. Because if you buy too much into the idea that the share price actually reflects upon your worth as a person, right?
Yep.
Then you're causing unnecessary stress. You're also buying into a worldview that any child can tell you is absolutely incorrect, that if your own dog or cat could speak, they would disagree with. Your spouse, your family, your closest buddies, your closest friends would completely disagree with this notion that your worth depends upon the share price.
Uh,
So, yeah. So,
yeah,
go.
absolutely. And I mean, I can imagine one of the reasons your clientele come to you. It's a pretty lonely role, right? And once you get towards the top of the hierarchical chart, um, the org chart, it's pretty lonely. I remember the first GM role that I was put into in a sort of multinational environment. And I was told at the time, just be aware, this is one of the loneliest roles in the business. And that was true.
Yep.
So, I mean, how do you help your clients with that? I mean, in terms of everyone, ultimately, most of the organizations looking up, expecting you to have all the answers. Yet when you look up, where do you go for support? I mean, obviously there are professionals like yourself that they can come and see, but how else do you help your clients with that?
Well, there are several answers that come to mind. I might make reference to professional athletes who are often singularly on the field,
Mm.
and they can't wait for their fans to cheer before they feel capable. They can't run to the coach whenever they have a doubt and ask for validation. Inside their heads, they have to be their own best source of encouragement and validation and support. So that's one of my answers. Because there's very few people or nobody above you you can look to for validation. Um, and also because a leader at that point in his or her career is knowledgeable enough, is capable enough, and has good enough judgment to be their own best source of encouragement and positivity and validation, looking inwardly is, I would say, the most dependable place to turn
Mm.
in order to find a kind word. And at first, sometimes people feel like it's kind of silly to sit and say to yourself, I did a good job today, or I deserve this vacation, or you don't have to care what that one person said. Their opinion is not well informed. So sometimes people kind of feel silly talking to themselves like that in ways they would actually talk to colleagues. But the same kinds of things that would uplift and encourage and hearten a colleague are the same kinds of words that would encourage and hearten oneself. It just is very often we have double standards where we give our warmth and our support to other people and somehow consider ourselves to be an exception to the rule.
I
Much
wonder.
of what I see. Yeah, please.
So I wonder why we do that. And then I actually, when you use the word validation several
Hmm.
times, and I have to say the question in my own head was, oh, validation. Why does that sound needy to me? Sounds like I'd be being needy if I need validation for something, which
Yeah.
the intelligent, logical part of my brain said, well, that's ridiculous. But the
Well,
emotional side was kind of, it was, I was being
here's,
triggered that felt needy.
here's why I think it is. So, um, children are, frankly, much more needy than adults are. And among all their needs is to have validation that they are doing the right thing, that they are on the right path in life, that their work is good enough, that their finger painting is beautiful enough. So children, kind of look to the adults above them. And then as we transition into being young adults, we have a little bit more judgment. We have a little bit more knowledge of ourselves and the world, and what we should do in the world or how we should conduct ourselves. Um, and then by the time that someone reaches a senior leadership role, they do have very good judgment. They have a proven track record. They are, I might use this term, fully and legitimately a real adult. Um, so I think the reason that you kind of maybe internally cringe or you feel that kind of internal resistance is that um, you don't want to see yourself as being like a junior employee. You don't want to see yourself as being like a child when in fact you've reached the top of your game. And um, well, just to kind of tie it back in with the idea of self-validation. Self-validation is different from turning to other people for validation. People lower in the org chart or people who are just students, they do have to turn to people who are more experienced or knowledgeable for validation and guidance and encouragement. But one of the things they don't tell you when you become a leader is once you reach the top, you must become self-validating. And I'll address this. Often, people, have some resistance against the idea of being self-congratulatory, or they think that being self-validating is going to turn them into a solipsistic, narcissistic jerk. And it doesn't. Just like when you're kind and supportive toward your friends and family, it doesn't turn them into a jerk. It actually makes them happier people.
Mm, yeah.
being kind toward yourself, upholding the same standard in the privacy of your own head and heart that you do for other people around you is not going to turn you into a jerk. It's actually upholding one singular universal standard. And, often I think the problems people have are based on the fact that they do remember when they were junior. They do remember when they knew less. They do remember when they were a child in grade 8 when they said that thing and everyone laughed. But here's another message I have to give to um, my adult clients. It's that other people judge you as the person you are today. So, anytime you're thinking back to who you were 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, or even longer ago, that version of you is now obsolete, out of date, and no one in your workplace really cares how badly you did 30 years ago. They just literally don't care. So if you also don't care, you're joining all those people around you who are judging you as you are today, as a mature, experienced professional, as opposed to a former adolescent or a former child.
Absolutely. And I should really appreciate the way you're framing it as it's a double standard, because you're right. Most leaders are absolutely will praise and support and be very generous with helping others to thrive and to grow and so on, yet don't do it for themselves. It's quite a fascinating subject, isn't it? But out of interest, and I know we did talk about this briefly previously, but and that interested me as well. So the self-talk, the self-congratulations, how's that different from affirmations?
Good question. So when I hear the word affirmations, and I know I'm not talking about all affirmations, I'm just talking about
Sure.
the way it's sometimes taught. I imagine someone looking in the mirror, imagining how they want to be, and telling themselves that that is how they are, or that that is the current truth. And often when people do affirmations, they just don't believe themselves, or they feel like they're lying. And it's because in a way they kind of are. Now, when you're giving yourself supportive or self congratulatory has such negative connotations, but I would say in the privacy of your own head, it's appropriate. It's just like when you fist pump at the office, that's where it can get kind of tacky.
Yep.
But inside your own head, to recognize the good work that you do is actually recognizing the truth. The difference between affirmations as I've described, I know it's not all affirmations, but
Sure.
affirmations as I've described them, and being self-validating or being your own best source of encouragement and praise is when you're giving yourself encouragement and praise, you're recognizing that you did sacrifice a lot earlier in your career to be in the role that you're at. You do deserve the audiences who sit and lap up everything you say. These are the truths of your present life. It may not have been true 20 or 30 years ago, like we had discussed, but the present day truth is you've built up your career, you've built up your life up to this point. You are actually the person who did that. And that's the difference between, kind of telling yourself that um, that you're a leader if you have no direct reports.
Yeah, sure. And that also makes a lot of sense, I have to say. So, in terms of the self-talk, in terms of the self-congratulations, do you give advice to your clients about how to do that, or when
Yeah.
when the triggers would be to start installing that as a habit?
Um, so in terms of the content, I summarize it succinctly as what you would say to someone you're mentoring who's in the same situation as you, or what you would say to a friend or a child who's in the same situation as you. And then I don't really have to say anything else because people who reach leadership positions, they know how to praise, they kind of know how to manage. So the right words are there. I'm just saying, end the double standard and talk to yourself the way you would talk to any of your employees. When it comes to how to kind of recognize um, when when to be doing this, um, often it's when So earlier I talked about how some of my clients will have a stressful work day. They'll go home, they'll open a bottle of wine, or they'll smoke a joint, and that's the habit they first present with. So one answer that comes to mind is that it's when you feel tempted to do something to fulfill something that's not actually a need. Now, I would actually say that if one is to be happy, one should have his or her accomplishments validated, right? It's not a luxury. Like, would you ever put someone you're managing in a position where you never give them positive feedback, but their mistakes are noticed? Probably not,
Of
because
course.
that person would not thrive. Yet, many of my clients put themselves in an environment, even if it's inside their heads, where they have no positive feedback or very little positive feedback, and yet all their mistakes are amplified and they do hear the criticisms. And we can't expect anyone to thrive under those conditions. So many people will drink a bottle of wine when they get home. Many people will smoke a joint. So the 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 trigger is that when you feel a lack, just like if you feel thirsty, it's telling you go drink some water. If you feel hungry, it's telling you go eat some food. But if you have worked hard, if you've done good work, and you feel a lack because your good work hasn't been recognized, that right there is the right time to fill in the gap, pick up the slack because you're at the top of the hierarchy, be a good boss to yourself, and give yourself the same validation, the same praise that you would give anyone else in your situation.
And that relies, I mean, yeah, and then in understanding your audience, there's an intelligent, logical angle of everything you've just said that I imagine, boom, they get it, no
Yeah.
question. But in the heat of battle,
Mhm.
back into when they're not sitting in your comfy chair with your silky smooth, relaxing voice in their ears, when they're in the heat of battle, actually implementing that, remembering to implement that in the right moments, because I'm sure throughout each and every day they are doing things that they probably should give themselves a little high five for, but they somehow take
Yep.
for granted. It's just, well, that's what I do. um,
Yeah.
and almost just, well, next, move on to the next thing.
Yep.
I mean, is that something through hypnosis that you can help with, or is it just really appealing to the logic and intelligence of a person?
Well, so you might notice that the kinds of attitudes or perspectives I give to people are quite logical. I sort of apply the standard of, is this something a healthy person would think? Is this is this a perspective or a belief that an ideal person would pick as a belief or a thought pattern or a habit to keep? Um, so um, change often feels like a big ship turning around as opposed to a speedboat doing a quick turn. And change actually only just kind of begins in an office like this, but it continues in the context of the client's own life. So usually what happens is, in a first session, for example, I'll give people some foundational beliefs like the ones we've talked about that will send them out to the world to live a week or a week and a half of their life. And that gives them 7 to 10 days to either open a bottle of wine or consider everything they heard and accepted while they were in this office as an alternative mindset and an alternative way to live. And usually, when they come in for session two, they'll report that some of what I've said has stuck and other parts of what I've said have not yet stuck. So then we kind of reinforce what has stuck as your new normal. So, all those nights that you sat down and you put on headphones and you listened to your favorite music that you didn't have the time to enjoy wholeheartedly since you were 25 years old, that is going to be the new normal or an example of the new normal. And then we kind of put a spotlight on the nights where they uh, exhibited a behavior they'd rather change in the future. and we look at, what was lacking, what wasn't quite there yet. Sometimes reinforcement or repetition is beneficial. In other cases, the messaging that I communicate to the client has to be adapted to new information that arises. So, for example, if I find out that their spouse is the one opening up the bottle of wine and they're just kind of saying yes, then that client needs an additional set of messages compared to if they're actually finding the wine bottle and finding the corkscrew, and they're actually opening it up and they're actually finding a clean glass. But I mean, people don't open wine by accident. People don't light up a cigarette and put it in their mouth by accident. There are a number of steps before those kinds of things
Sure.
happen. And
Yeah, yeah.
just one thing that I would say characterizes uh, the high achieving senior leaders who we're talking about, and I think one of your previous episodes alludes to this, but there's intrinsic motivation and there's extrinsic motivation. And also, there's something called internal locus of control versus external locus of control. And people with intrinsic motivation, intrinsic locus of control, they tend to achieve more in life. They're they feel in charge of their destiny. When they suffer setbacks, they believe they can actually do something about it. They're not as fatalistic. And they often end up being the high achievers. They often end up rising up to the top of companies. So um, often the missing piece of the puzzle isn't the ability to do something other than open the bottle of wine. Often it's they just don't really know what else to do. They haven't had any other behavior normalized. They haven't had like a clear-headed evening with their husband and their kids normalized, or at least it's been years. So, one of the ways that rapid change happens is if someone has an internal locus of control and all they're missing is some guidance as to what to think and what attitudes to adopt. You put the two together and they're good.
Yeah, absolutely. And just for those not familiar with it, I'd love if you could just dig in a little bit with the locus of control, what that is, what you're
Yeah,
referring
yes,
to there.
yes. So, someone with an internal locus of control believes that the good things or the bad things that happen to them are their doing. Someone with an external locus of control believes that the good things or the bad things that happen to them are because of external circumstances. So, talking about smokers, for example, someone with an internal locus of control um, who quit smoking thinks, I did it. So, in their head, they think, I'm the one who quit smoking. And if they start smoking again, they'll come back and they'll tell me that they started smoking again.
Yeah.
Someone with an external locus of control, if they quit smoking, they say, the hypnosis worked. They say, Luke made me stop smoking. They don't really credit themselves. And then if they start smoking again, they'll come back and they'll tell me, well, I was on vacation. My friend bought a pack of cigarettes. I couldn't help myself. Of course, I had to smoke. So you can see that the internal locus of control is just so much more of a helpful worldview to operate through that people with that worldview tend to achieve more.
And what determines that? I mean, are we hardwired from birth to be one or
I,
the other, or is that something
I,
that can be trained?
I actually don't know the research
Mm.
into it too deeply. I do believe it tends to be like a personality trait in that it doesn't change very much over a lifetime. Um, but at least I do what I can do to remind someone if I hear that they have an external locus of control, that actually you're the one putting your boots on, trudging through the snow, going to the LCBO, the government-run liquor store. You're the one plopping $20 on the counter. You're the one purchasing the bottle. You're the one trudging back. You're the one who's opening up that bottle of wine, and that's undeniably true.
And when that happened, I mean, do you dig into the root cause of why certain behaviors are the way they are, or do you have a different approach?
Well, there are many schools of thought within hypnotherapy, but
Yep.
also just within the world at large, many schools of thought as to why we do the things we do.
Mm,
Um, I'm not speaking for all hypnotherapists when I say that I tend not to dig into causative factors.
mm,
I tend to work under the the belief that as long as we can clearly define the ideal mindset and lead the client toward the ideal mindset and help the client around challenges they might encounter getting closer to the ideal mindset, it doesn't matter where exactly we're starting from. So I'll use the analogy of getting into a cab to go back home. It doesn't matter whether you're starting at this bar or this restaurant or this theater. You're telling the cab driver, take me to this address. And the cab driver, points the vehicle in the right direction and gets you to the address, routing around any detours along the way. So that's kind of how I see what I do, where as long as we're clearly defining the outcome and we're helping the client route around challenges, it doesn't matter as much where we are starting from or how the client got to be the way that they did. Sometimes it's helpful to know, but it's not strictly
yeah,
necessary.
sure. It feels like an important reframer, and I know, for example, my foray into the world of positive psychology over the last couple of years, I immediately was attracted to the approach of positive psychology versus what I perceive the traditional approach of psychology to be. The sit down and
Yeah.
let's take you back to your childhood. Let's see what the root cause was. And I much prefer the spin on that, the reframe with positive psychology, which is I think what you're describing. It's a similar way. And I think when we spoke last time, you referred to it as you're teaching people to think like someone who doesn't have that problem actually.
Yes. And in my experience, so I have done hypnotherapy of the style where you look at the past, where you look at where, for example, a client first picked up a smoking habit. I've stopped doing it like that. And since then, and I don't know whether it's just experience, um, but it seems like the programs I'm doing with clients are shorter without looking at the past. Now, before I would look at the past and the future, but it seems like cutting out that element of looking at the past doesn't take away too much from the end results. And I think my best model for how this works is that like I said with the cab analogy, that
Yeah,
it doesn't matter where we're starting from
perfect.
if the destination is the same.
Yeah, no, absolutely perfect, and certainly appreciated from my side. Look, I'm conscious of time. Um, I mean, I have to say this conversation's been fascinating, and I know that it's going to be well received by our audience. Um, is there anything else you'd like to add at this point? I mean, just in terms of general advice. I mean, even down to for those who have now understood more about what you do and your approach, and therefore maybe hypnosis could actually be very useful for them. And I know that you're not on this podcast um, sort of spruiking your services. That's not the point at all of this conversation. And that's cool. And you're in Canada, so for anyone around the world. What would be your advice if they feel they would benefit if they, and we're not here just talking about if someone has, they drink a bit too much or they smoke or they eat too much. It's not that. It's can be that, but it's not just that. It can be that looking just to perform better, just to unlock more of their potential. Um,
Yeah,
even,
well, I use hypnosis because it says hypnosis on my business card and my website and my door. Um, if I had chosen a different career path, I could just as easily be an author of books that people read by the millions, or I could be a motivational speaker speaking to a few hundred people at a time. Hypnosis just is how I set myself up early in my career. And I make a living at this, which kind of makes it hard to switch to like a motivational speaking career. Um, but hypnosis is a way to kind of accept ideas more readily, but it's always the ideas that matter more. And in my opinion, a good, sound idea worthy of keeping will stand up to rational scrutiny. And if it's spoken during a motivational speech, if it's written into a book, it's just as easy to wrap your head around and accept and adopt as if you were formally hypnotized, even if you might have to be contemplating that idea to make the speaker or the author's words your own. So, the advice I would have is to look for good ideas wherever you hear them. Don't see yourself as fundamentally different from a confident, happy, relaxed person. See it as they have influences earlier in their life that maybe you didn't have, or you had influences that they didn't have. But as an adult, as a conscious, self reflective human being, you can choose your influences. It's not just hypnotists, it's anyone with a really good perspective on how the world works or what a high quality life is like, or what thoughts or attitudes are worth keeping. Let them affect you. Take on their perspectives, take on their mindsets as your own, and you'll be the judge of which perspectives or which mindsets are worth keeping. Sometimes it's going to be your own heart that gives you perspectives or mindsets. Sometimes you have your best ideas yourself, but be selective about the thoughts that you deem worthy of keeping for, by analogy, the mental scrapbook of your mind, and then choose which thoughts or perspectives or memories are not worth keeping for the mental scrapbook of your mind. So, hypnosis, like, as we talked about at the start, I didn't want to emphasize the hypnosis part because to
Mm.
me, this is about spreading good ideas worth keeping, worth, me saying and then your listeners adopting for themselves. But it's hardly just me in my office figuring out how to live a good, high quality life. The Stoics had a pretty good idea of how to live a good, high quality life. A lot of therapists have a pretty good idea of how to live a good, high quality life.
Which is ultimately what we should all be striving for, huh? Living a good, high
Exactly.
quality life.
Exactly.
That's certainly the message that we're moving people towards. Look, Luke, I appreciate your time so much. Thank you ever so much for your wisdom as well. Very generous. And there you have it. Thanks very much for listening. And if you've enjoyed this, please go ahead and leave us a review on whichever platform you're using. It really does help more than you know. And if you're interested in grabbing a copy of my book, Lead by Example, which talks about how you can unleash your potential at work and in life, I would love to send it to you. If you go to theimpactproject.io, take a bit of a deep dive down the rabbit hole, it'll be on your doorstep in no time at all. My thanks to Luke. We'll be posting all of the various links to Luke's socials and his website in the show notes. And until next time, be brave. As Luke also said, have fun and make yourself busy having an impact in the world.